The morning of June 4th, 1942, 20,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, northeast of Midway Atoll, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney adjusted his oxygen mask as his Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress droned toward the Japanese carrier force. Through breaks in the clouds below, he could see the distinctive shapes of enemy warships maneuvering in formation. 12 heavy bombers flew behind him, their engines creating a rhythmic thunder that echoed across empty sky. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Each aircraft carried a 10-man crew and enough defensive armament to make attacking fighters think twice. But as Sweeney's bombardiers prepared their runs, something unexpected happened. Zero fighters climbed to intercept, their Nakajima Sakai engines straining at altitude. The Japanese pilots had faced American bombers before lightly armed observation planes, vulnerable patrol aircraft, slow-moving transports. What they encountered at 20,000 feet that morning was something fundamentally different. The B-17 seconds opened fire with their .50 caliber Browning machine guns. Not one or two weapons, but multiple guns from each aircraft, creating interlocking fields of fire that filled the sky with tracer rounds. The volume of defensive firepower surprised the Zero pilots. They pressed their attacks half-heartedly, breaking away after brief engagements. One American observer later noted the Japanese fighters seemed reluctant, their hearts not in their work. The Zeros had met something unexpected. These American bombers didn't fly alone and helpless. They flew in formation, mutually supporting each other with coordinated defensive fire from weapons that could reach out and kill at distances the Japanese pilots had never experienced from bomber armament. This was neither the first nor the last time Japanese aviators would encounter the Flying Fortress's defensive capabilities. But it represented a pattern that had been developing since the war began 6 months earlier, a pattern that fundamentally challenged Japanese assumptions about bomber vulnerability and fighter superiority. The story begins not with American strength, but with Japanese confidence. By December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy's fighter pilots considered themselves among the world's finest aviators. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, an aircraft that had dominated Chinese skies for over a year. The Zero represented Japanese aeronautical engineering at its apex, lightweight, maneuverable, possessing exceptional range for a carrier-based fighter. Its design philosophy emphasized performance over protection. Every unnecessary pound had been eliminated. No armor protected the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks guarded against fire. The Zero weighed just over 5,000 pounds empty, making it extraordinarily agile in combat. Its armament reflected Japanese fighter doctrine. Two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns mounted in the cowling, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. Two 20mm Type 99 cannons mounted in the wings, each carrying 60 rounds of ammunition. The machine guns provided sustained fire for ranging and harassment. The cannons delivered killing blows once the pilot achieved proper position. Japanese pilots trained extensively in deflection shooting and close-quarters combat. Their doctrine emphasized individual skill and aggressive tactics. A properly trained Zero pilot could outmaneuver virtually any opponent, using superior agility to achieve killing position before the enemy could react. The Japanese had good reason for confidence. In China, Zeros achieved kill ratios approaching 12-1 against Chinese fighters. When war came to the Pacific in December 1941, Japanese naval aviation appeared unstoppable. The attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated devastating effectiveness. Over 350 Japanese aircraft struck Oahu that Sunday morning, achieving complete tactical surprise. Among the attackers flew Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, leading 9 Zero fighters in strafing runs against Hickam Field. What Itaya and his pilots didn't anticipate was the arrival of American reinforcements during the attack itself. 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses had departed Hamilton Field in California the previous evening, bound for the Philippines with refueling stops in Hawaii. 4 were older B-17C models, equipped with 4.50 caliber machine guns and 1.30 caliber nose gun. 8 were newer B-17E variants, carrying significantly improved armament, 8.50 caliber weapons plus 1.30 caliber, distributed across nose, dorsal, ventral, waist, and tail positions. The newer E models featured something revolutionary, a powered tail turret mounting twin .50 caliber guns, providing genuine rear hemisphere defense. The B-17 seconds arrived over Oahu precisely at the height of the Japanese attack. None carried ammunition. General Hap Arnold had personally briefed their crews before departure, explaining that the extreme range to Hawaii required maximum fuel capacity. The guns would be loaded after landing, before the final leg to the Philippines. The crews assumed their greatest danger would come during that second leg over Japanese-controlled waters. They were spectacularly wrong. Lieutenant Robert Richards piloted the first B-17 to make landfall. His co-pilot, Leonard Humiston, initially thought the anti-aircraft fire bursting around them represented a Navy welcoming ceremony. Then Zeros attacked from behind, and reality became unmistakably clear. Richards' unarmed bomber absorbed machine gun and cannon fire. His crew could only watch helplessly as Japanese fighters made repeated passes. Unable to return fire, Richards focused on survival, getting his crippled aircraft onto the ground before it exploded or broke apart. Captain Raymond Swenson faced similar circumstances. His B-17C encountered 2 Zeros during final approach to Hickam. The Japanese fighters opened fire from behind, their 7.7mm rounds stitching holes in aluminum skin. One burst ignited the flare locker, filling the fuselage with magnesium fire. Swenson fought to maintain control as his aircraft filled with choking smoke and burning debris. He kept the bomber flying long enough for his crew to evacuate, then brought it down hard on Hickam's runway. The B-17 broke in half from fire damage as it slid to a stop, but the crew survived testimony to both Swenson's skill and the fortress's structural integrity, even under catastrophic damage. Other crews fared better. Major Truman Landon managed to land his B-17E without taking hits, though Japanese fighters swarmed the airspace around him. Several aircraft diverted to alternate fields when Hickam appeared too dangerous. One B-17 set down on a golf course. Another landed at a fighter strip designed for much smaller aircraft. The Fortress's robust landing gear and structural strength allowed survival in conditions that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Of 12 B-17 seconds that arrived during the attack, 2 were destroyed and several damaged. But most survived, and their crews lived to fight another day. More importantly, Japanese pilots gained their first combat experience against American heavy bombers. What they learned should have concerned them. The B-17 seconds had been unarmed and caught completely by surprise, yet they proved difficult to destroy. Their defensive positions, though empty of guns and ammunition, represented genuine engineering thought about protecting bombers from fighter attack. The powered turrets, the distributed gun positions, the structural strength that allowed damaged aircraft to continue flying all suggested American bomber doctrine differed fundamentally from what Japanese pilots had encountered before. But Pearl Harbor represented only the beginning. The real education would come in subsequent months as the Pacific War developed. 8 hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck American airfields in the Philippines. The 1941st Bombardment Group, based at Clark Field, operated a mixed force of B-17C and B-17D models. 35 aircraft representing the most powerful American bomber concentration in the Far East. General Douglas MacArthur's air commander, General Louis Brereton, had received word of the Pearl Harbor attack and requested permission to launch preemptive strikes against Japanese airfields on Formosa. MacArthur delayed granting approval while waiting for better intelligence. The delay proved catastrophic. Japanese bombers arrived over Clark Field at midday to find American aircraft parked in neat rows, refueling and rearming for missions that would never launch. Mitsubishi G-3M and G-4M bombers struck first, cratering runways and destroying support facilities. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Then Zero fighters swept in at low altitude, strafing the parked fortresses with machine gun and cannon fire. Within minutes, half the American heavy bomber force in the Philippines had been destroyed on the ground. The surviving B-17 seconds scattered to secondary airfields, beginning a fighting retreat that would continue for months. But when these bombers did fly combat missions, Japanese pilots discovered the same troubling reality their colleagues had encountered at Pearl Harbor. Armed B-17 seconds represented formidable opponents. The fortresses flew at altitudes where Zeros struggled to maintain performance. Above 20,000 feet, the Zero's large wing area and relatively low-powered engine became liabilities rather than assets. The lightweight fighter lost maneuverability in thin air, while the B-17's turbocharged Wright Cyclone engines maintained full power, actually improving performance as altitude increased. Captain Colin Kelly piloted one early mission against Japanese shipping, his B-17 attacking what the crew believed was a battleship. After the bombing run, Zeros pounced on Kelly's aircraft. One pilot was Saburo Sakai, destined to become one of Japan's highest-scoring aces. Sakai's cannon fire tore into the fortress, causing catastrophic damage. Kelly ordered his crew to bail out, remaining at the controls to maintain level flight while his men escaped. The B-17 exploded before Kelly could jump, killing him instantly. He received posthumous recognition as one of America's first war heroes. Yet even this successful interception revealed troubling patterns. Sakai had needed multiple attack passes and expenditure of significant ammunition to bring down a single bomber. The B-17's structural strength allowed it to absorb punishment that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Its defensive guns, when manned and supplied with ammunition, created zones of lethal fire that forced attacking fighters to respect minimum engagement distances. Japanese pilots, accustomed to pressing attacks to point-blank range against Chinese opponents, found themselves taking casualties when they employed similar tactics against American bombers. The B-17 seconds couldn't stop the Japanese advance. Too few aircraft spread across too many missions couldn't stem the tide of invasion forces moving south from Formosa and west from the Marshall Islands. The 1941st Bombardment Group retreated to Java, then to Australia, conducting desperate strikes against overwhelming Japanese forces. But the psychological impact of these engagements exceeded their tactical results. Japanese fighter pilots began reporting that American heavy bombers were exceptionally difficult to destroy. Even damaged fortresses often made it back to base, their crews living to fly again. The defensive firepower impressed Japanese aviators most. A single B-17E carried 8.50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute. The Browning M2.50 cal represented one of World War II's most effective aircraft weapons. Its 12.7 mm projectile combined sufficient weight and velocity to damage aircraft at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate engine blocks, rupture fuel tanks, and kill pilots through armor plate at distances where lighter weapons merely scratched paint. When multiple B-17 seconds flew in formation, which became standard American tactical doctrine, their combined defensive fire created an interlocking barrier that made successful attacks extraordinarily difficult. Japanese fighters approaching a 3-aircraft element faced potential engagement by 24 heavy machine guns, all capable of inflicting fatal damage. The fortress crews trained extensively in coordinated defensive tactics, with gunners calling out threats and concentrating fire on the most dangerous attackers. This contrasted sharply with Japanese bomber doctrine. The Mitsubishi G3M and G4M bombers that formed the backbone of Japanese Naval Air Force striking power carried defensive armament of 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns, but in smaller numbers and with more limited fields of fire. Japanese bombers relied primarily on fighter escort for protection, while American heavy bombers were designed from the outset to fight their way to targets and back with or without friendly fighters present. The philosophical difference reflected broader industrial and strategic realities. Japan's aircraft industry emphasized lightweight designs that maximized performance with minimum resources. American industry, with vastly greater productive capacity, could afford to build larger, heavier aircraft, carrying extensive defensive armament and armor protection. A fully loaded B-17E weighed approximately 54,000 pounds, more than 10 times the weight of an unloaded Zero. That weight included not just bombs and fuel, but also armor plate protecting crew positions, self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented fires, and enough ammunition to sustain defensive fire through extended combat. Japanese pilots recognized they faced a technology gap. Their 20mm cannons could destroy a B-17 with well-placed hits if the pilot could achieve proper position and accuracy. The cannon's low muzzle velocity and slow rate of fire made precision shooting difficult, especially against a maneuvering target at long range. Most Zero pilots saved their limited cannon ammunition for killing blows, using machine guns for initial attacks and ranging. But the 7.7mm rounds often proved insufficient against the fortress's heavy structure and armor protection. Multiple Japanese pilots reported instances of expending hundreds of machine gun rounds into American bombers without achieving knockdowns. The frustration was palpable. Pilots who had dominated Chinese skies, who had swept aside British and Dutch opposition in Malaya and the East Indies, found themselves unable to consistently destroy American heavy bombers, despite achieving good attack positions and scoring multiple hits. It violated every assumption about fighter versus bomber combat dynamics. The pattern continued as the war progressed. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, American carriers and land-based forces clashed with Japanese naval invasion forces. B-17 seconds from Australia conducted high-altitude strikes against Japanese shipping, with limited accuracy, but demonstrating the fortress's ability to operate deep in enemy-controlled airspace. Zero pilots intercepted these raids but struggled to inflict decisive losses. The bombers' altitude advantage and defensive firepower forced Japanese fighters into disadvantageous attack geometries. Then came Midway. The battle, fought northeast of the tiny atoll in early June 1942, would determine the Pacific War's trajectory. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, designed an elaborate operation to lure America's remaining aircraft carriers into decisive battle. He committed Japan's most powerful striking force, 4 fleet carriers that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier force from his flagship Akagi, leading Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu with their complement of over 200 aircraft. American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz advance warning of the attack. He positioned his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown northeast of Midway in perfect ambush position. But the atoll itself required defense, and Midway's garrison included a hodgepodge of aircraft cobbled together from available units. Among them flew 17 B-17 flying fortresses, representing 3 different bombardment squadrons detached for this critical mission. The fortresses weren't the newest models. Most were B-17E variants, solid workhorses but lacking some refinements that later versions would incorporate. Their crews were experienced but not battle-hardened. Many had been training in the United States just weeks earlier. Now they faced Japan's finest carrier aviators in what would become one of history's most significant naval battles. The B-17 seconds would play a supporting role in a victory won primarily by dive bombers from the American carriers. But their encounters with Japanese fighters would provide revealing insights into the limitations of the Zero when confronting heavily armed American bombers. June 3rd saw the first contact. 9 B-17 seconds from the 431st Bombardment Squadron located Japanese transport ships approximately 600 miles west of Midway. Flying at high altitude, they conducted bombing runs that scored no hits but demonstrated the fortress's ability to operate in contested airspace. Japanese fighters from nearby carriers scrambled to intercept, but the distance and altitude made effective interception difficult. The B-17 seconds returned to Midway without losses, though some aircraft showed battle damage from long-range encounters. The real test came the following morning. Shortly after 04:30 on June 4th, Nagumo launched his first strike wave against Midway 108 aircraft, including 36 Zero fighters, 72 dive and torpedo bombers. The Japanese force hit the atoll hard, destroying facilities and killing defenders. But Midway's radar had detected the incoming strike early enough for every available aircraft to scramble. Marine fighters climbed to intercept, suffering terrible losses against the superior Zeros. But their sacrifice bought time for strike aircraft to launch counterattacks against the Japanese carriers. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney led 15 B-17 seconds, initially tasked with hitting the invasion fleet in a quick reorientation toward the newly discovered carrier force. His bombardiers had prepared for ship attacks from high altitude, using the Norden bomb site's sophisticated gyroscopic stabilization to calculate release points. At 0810, Sweeney's formation found the Japanese carriers circling beneath cloud cover. The fortress crews could see all four flat tops maneuvering in the distinctive box formation that Japanese doctrine prescribed for air defense. What happened next demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of high-altitude bombing. The B-17 seconds attacked by flights, concentrating their bomb loads on individual carriers. From 20,000 feet, bombardiers watched their ordnance fall toward targets that appeared the size of postage stamps. Japanese anti-aircraft fire burst at altitude, black puffs of smoke marking near misses that rocked aircraft but inflicted no serious damage. The gunners had found the correct altitude quickly, but couldn't track the bomber's lateral movement effectively. Then the Zeros climbed to intercept. 9 fighters from the Combat Air Patrol broke away from lower altitude engagements to challenge the high-flying fortresses. This was precisely the scenario Japanese pilots had been told to avoid. Engaging heavily armed bombers at extreme altitude, where their fighters performed poorly and the targets could concentrate defensive fire, represented textbook example of unfavorable combat geometry. But the carriers needed protection, and the Zeros were all that stood between American bombs and Japanese flight decks. The engagement lasted approximately 20 minutes. Zero pilots made repeated attack runs, primarily from the rear quarters where they hoped to avoid the bomber's nose and dorsal turret guns. They quickly discovered the B-17E's tail turret eliminated the blind spot that had made earlier fortress models vulnerable to stern attacks. Twin .50 caliber guns in the tail position provided effective coverage of the entire rear hemisphere. Japanese pilots found themselves taking fire at ranges that exceeded their own weapons' effective envelope. The cannon armament that worked so effectively against unarmored fighters proved less decisive against the fortress's heavy structure. 20mm explosive rounds could damage bombers, and several B-17 seconds absorbed hits that tore holes in wings and fuselage. But the fortress's redundant systems, multiple fuel pumps, backup electrical systems, control cables routed through different airframe sections, meant localized damage rarely caused catastrophic failure. One bomber took 3 cannon hits in the left wing without losing the engine or compromising flight control. The machine gun fire from the Zeros proved even less effective. 7.7mm rounds lacked the kinetic energy to penetrate the B-17's vital areas when fired from long range. Japanese pilots who tried closing to point-blank range, the tactic that had worked against Chinese and Allied fighters, found themselves flying through streams of .50 caliber tracers that made close approaches suicidal. The volume of fire surprised them. Each fortress could bring multiple guns to bear on a single attacker, and when bombers flew in formation, an attacking fighter might face fire from 6 or 8 heavy machine guns simultaneously. The Zero pilots broke off their attacks after inflicting only minor damage. Not a single B-17 was shot down. Several aircraft showed battle damage, punctured skin, damaged control surfaces, minor systems failures, but all returned to Midway. The Japanese carriers, meanwhile, successfully evaded every bomb dropped from the high-flying fortresses. The Norden bomb site's famous precision didn't translate to hits against maneuvering targets at sea. The B-17 crews would later claim multiple hits and several carriers damaged, but post-battle analysis revealed no direct hits were achieved during this engagement. Yet the tactical failure masked a more significant truth. The B-17 seconds had forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver continuously during the attack, disrupting their ability to recover the Midway strike force and launch counterattacks against American carriers. Every minute spent dodging high-altitude bombs was a minute lost to effective carrier operations, and the Zero fighters dispatched to intercept the fortresses were fighters unavailable for other duties, including the combat air patrol that should have been protecting the carriers from the dive bombers that would arrive shortly. Colonel Sweeney, leading the fortress formation, noted something peculiar in his post-mission report. The Zero pilots had seemed reluctant to press home their attacks. Their hearts were not in their work, he observed. This wasn't cowardice. Japanese fighter pilots had demonstrated exceptional courage throughout the campaign. Rather, it reflected a tactical calculation. The Zero pilots recognized they were fighting at a disadvantage. High altitude degraded their aircraft's performance. The fortress's defensive firepower made close approaches dangerous, and even successful attacks might not bring down the heavily built American bombers. For pilots trained in aggressive, close-quarters combat, this represented a fundamental challenge to their tactical doctrine. The Zero's advantages, maneuverability, climb rate, sustained turning ability, mattered less when the target was a bomber formation at 20,000 feet, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, capable of absorbing significant damage and continuing to fly. Japanese pilots who tried conventional stern attacks found themselves exposed to sustained fire from tail gunners who had clear fields of view and plenty of ammunition. Attempting beam attacks meant flying through the combined defensive fire of multiple bombers, with waist gunners tracking targets through wide-open windows. Head-on attacks offered better prospects. The fortress's nose armament in early E models was limited, and the closing speed gave gunners minimal time to track and fire. But head-on passes required exceptional nerve and precision. At combined closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, both pilot and gunner had perhaps 2 seconds to line up shots and fire. A pilot who flinched or broke away too early achieved nothing. A pilot who maintained course too long risked collision or fatal hits from the bomber's forward-firing guns. Only the most experienced and aggressive pilots could consistently execute effective head-on attacks. The Battle of Midway's outcome was decided not by the B-17 seconds but by dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown. In 5 minutes of devastating accuracy, American SBD Dauntless aircraft hit 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, with bombs that ignited aviation fuel and ordnance on their hangar decks. All 3 carriers would sink within hours. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a successful counterattack against Yorktown before being located and destroyed by American aircraft later that afternoon. By battle's end, Japan had lost all 4 fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. American forces lost Yorktown, but Enterprise and Hornet survived to fight again. The B-17 seconds participated in multiple strikes throughout the battle. Late in the afternoon of June 4th, another fortress formation attacked the burning carrier Hiryu and her escorts. Several Zeros from Hiryu's combat air patrol intercepted, shooting down 4 fighters they claimed, though American records don't confirm these losses. What's documented is that several B-17 seconds again returned to Midway, showing battle damage but remaining flyable. One aircraft arrived with over 30 holes in its airframe, testament to both the violence of the combat and the fortress's ability to survive punishment. Japanese pilots filing post-battle reports noted their frustration with the American heavy bombers. The fortresses couldn't be caught at altitude. When intercepted, they proved difficult to destroy. Their defensive armament commanded respect, forcing attack approaches that minimized effectiveness. And even when Japanese fighters scored hits, which they did, repeatedly the bombers often continued flying. It was like shooting at clouds, one pilot observed. The bullets went through, but the target remained. This pattern would repeat throughout the Pacific War's remaining years. B-17 seconds operated against Japanese forces in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the East Indies, and eventually the Philippines, again as American forces moved back across the Pacific. The fortress never achieved the fame in the Pacific that it would earn over Europe. By mid-1943, the B-24 Liberator, with longer range and greater payload capacity, replaced the B-17 inches most Pacific units. But during those critical first 18 months of war, the fortress provided America's only heavy bomber capability in the theater. Japanese pilots never developed truly effective tactics against fortress formations. Individual aces achieved successes through exceptional skill and aggressive tactics. But systematic victory required either overwhelming numerical advantage or specialized weapons. Some Japanese units experimented with air-to-air bombing fighters carrying small bombs to drop on bomber formations from above. Others tried ramming attacks, deliberately colliding with American bombers to bring them down at the cost of the attacking fighter. These desperate measures reflected the difficulty of conventional attacks against heavily armed, structurally robust targets. The fundamental problem was firepower disparity. A single B-17E carried 8.50 caliber machine guns with over 5,000 rounds of ammunition. A Zero carried two small caliber machine guns with 500 rounds each, plus two 20mm cannons with just 60 rounds per gun. The fortress gunners could sustain fire for extended periods, walking tracers onto targets and maintaining pressure on attackers. Zero pilots had to make their ammunition count, taking calculated shots rather than hosing targets with sustained fire. The Americans understood this advantage and exploited it ruthlessly. Fortress formations flew in mutually supporting elements, typically 3 aircraft in a tight V, stacked vertically with additional elements above and below. Any fighter attempting to attack one bomber had to run a gauntlet of fire from adjacent aircraft. The formation commander, usually flying lead in the center position, coordinated defensive tactics through radio communication. Gunners called out threats by clock position and distance, allowing multiple guns to concentrate fire on the most dangerous attackers. This represented a stark contrast to Japanese bomber formations, which relied primarily on fighter escort for protection. When Japanese bombers flew without escort, which happened increasingly as the war progressed and fighter strength declined, they suffered catastrophic losses to American fighters. The philosophy reflected different industrial capabilities and strategic circumstances. Japan, fighting a war of conquest across vast distances with limited resources, emphasized lightweight designs that maximized range and performance. America, with massive industrial capacity and secure production bases, could afford to build larger, heavier aircraft optimized for survivability rather than maximum performance. The .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun became arguably America's most important aircraft weapon. Reliable, effective at long range, capable of damaging heavily built aircraft, the M2 equipped nearly every American fighter and bomber. Its 12.7mm projectile represented a sweet spot between rifle-caliber machine guns, which lacked stopping power, and cannons, which had lower rates of fire and smaller ammunition loads. American production capacity meant ammunition was essentially unlimited. Gunners could afford to fire sustained bursts, keeping attackers at distance through sheer volume of fire. Japanese pilots acknowledged this grudgingly in post-war interviews. The American heavy bombers were formidable opponents, several veterans recalled. Their defensive firepower exceeded anything in Japanese service. A Zero that absorbed even a few .50 caliber hits might suffer catastrophic failure, engine damage, fuel system failure, structural breakup. The lightweight construction that gave the Zero its agility became a fatal weakness when American gunners found the range. One hit could be fatal. A short burst could destroy the aircraft completely. Saburo Sakai, who survived the war as Japan's third highest-scoring ace, spoke frankly about the challenge. Attacking American bombers required different tactics than fighting other fighters, he explained. You couldn't dogfight with a fortress. You had to make quick passes, fire accurately, and break away before the defensive gunners tracked you. Even then, success wasn't guaranteed. Sakai himself was badly wounded in 1942 when he attacked what he thought was a lone bomber. Turned out to be an SBD Dauntless with a rear gunner. The .50 caliber rounds hit his cockpit, destroying one eye and nearly killing him. He flew 4 hours back to base, partially blind and barely conscious, demonstrating the same kind of determination that allowed damaged B-17 crews to limp home. The war's progression ultimately rendered these early encounters historical curiosities. American carrier aircraft, particularly the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, achieved air superiority over Japanese fighters through combination of superior performance and overwhelming numbers. Long-range P-38 Lightning fighters provided effective bomber escort for strikes against Japanese bases. The B-29 Superfortress, with even heavier armament and pressurized crew compartments allowing operations above 30,000 feet, replaced earlier bombers for strategic strikes. By 1944, the Zero was obsolete, outclassed by American fighters that combined the fortress's rugged construction with performance equal to or better than Japanese designs. But those early engagements, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Coral Sea, Midway, established patterns that persisted throughout the conflict. American bombers would not be helpless victims. Their defensive armament commanded respect. Their structural integrity allowed survival under damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. And their crews, though often inexperienced initially, learned quickly and fought with determined courage. Japanese pilots who dismissed American aviators as soft or incompetent learned painful lessons. The men who flew fortresses into combat against overwhelming opposition were neither soft nor incompetent. They were warriors who understood their mission and executed it despite terrible odds. The numbers tell part of the story. During the Battle of Midway, B-17 seconds flew multiple missions against Japanese forces without losing a single aircraft to fighter attack, despite facing the finest naval aviators in Japan's arsenal. Throughout the Pacific War's first year, fortress losses to Japanese fighters remained remarkably low, considering the number of missions flown and encounters with enemy aircraft. The defensive firepower worked. Not perfectly, Japanese fighters did shoot down B-17 seconds when conditions favored the attackers, but systematically and consistently enough that American bomber crews could expect reasonable survival prospects, even when flying deep into enemy-controlled airspace. The psychological impact extended beyond tactical results. Japanese pilots who had dominated Pacific skies for 6 months discovered they faced opponents with technical advantages that skill and courage couldn't overcome. The Americans possessed industrial capacity to build aircraft that Japanese factories couldn't match. They fielded weapons like the .50 caliber machine gun that exceeded Japanese equivalents in effectiveness. And they demonstrated willingness to absorb losses while learning from mistakes, constantly improving tactics and equipment. For Zero pilots accustomed to easy victories, the fortress represented an uncomfortable truth. American forces would not collapse under initial assault. They would fight back with increasing effectiveness, and they possessed resources that Japan, for all its early victories, could never match. The 4 carriers lost at Midway could not be quickly replaced. The experienced aircrew killed in those battles were irreplaceable. Japanese pilot training programs couldn't produce replacements fast enough to maintain veteran force levels. Meanwhile, American factories were just beginning to reach full production capacity. American training bases were graduating thousands of new aircrew every month, building an organizational depth that Japan couldn't approach. The defensive firepower of 8 B-17 seconds at Midway or 12 at Pearl Harbor, or the handful operating from Australia in early 1942, seems almost trivial, compared to the 1,000 bomber raids that would strike Germany later in the war. But those early fortresses, flying missions against overwhelming opposition with minimal support, established credibility for American air power in the Pacific. They demonstrated that even when outnumbered and surprised, American forces would fight effectively. The guns worked. The aircraft could take punishment and continue flying. The crews had the skill and courage to complete their missions. Japanese intelligence officers analyzing early battles should have recognized the implications. The Americans weren't going to surrender after initial defeats. They had resources to sustain a long war. Their bomber defensive armament represented just one example of technical sophistication that Japan would struggle to match. The warning signs were visible from the war's first days, but momentum, overconfidence, and strategic commitments to resource acquisition in Southeast Asia prevented Japanese leadership from recognizing how badly they had miscalculated. The fortresses flying over Midway, absorbing fire, continuing their missions, returning to base despite damage, embodied America's industrial advantage made tangible in aluminum and steel. The story ends where it began, in the skies over the Pacific, where men fought and died in machines that represented their nation's industrial capabilities and strategic doctrines. The Japanese Zeros were magnificent aircraft, products of brilliant design work and skilled craftsmanship. Their pilots were among the world's finest, trained to exceptional standards, and imbued with warrior spirit that valued victory above survival. But they faced opponents who had made different choices, choosing survivability over pure performance, firepower over elegance, industrial capacity over individual excellence. The B-17 flying fortresses weren't faster than Zeros. They couldn't outmaneuver Japanese fighters, but they carried enough defensive firepower to make attacking them dangerous, enough structural strength to survive hits that would destroy lighter aircraft, and enough operational range to strike deep into enemy territory. When Japanese Zero pilots admitted they had never faced firepower like the fortress's .50 caliber batteries, they acknowledged a truth that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. America had entered the war with equipment, training, and industrial capacity that Japan couldn't match through any realistic means. The defensive machine guns were impressive and merited respect. The productive capacity behind them, the ability to build thousands of bombers, millions of rounds of ammunition, and to replace every loss faster than combat could inflict them, was overwhelming and ultimately decisive. That was the real lesson of those early encounters, though it would take years of bloody combat before all participants fully comprehended the implications. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.